Introduction to the Paperback Edition. Since writing The Mindful Athlete, I've met mindful athletes from across the country of every shape, size, color, and age. Whether we know it or not, we are all mindful athletes. Life is a marathon. We go and go, others running alongside us. In order to run this marathon, we need to train in the same way any other athlete trains to compete effectively in a sport. Without awareness and clear intention, we may start off too slowly, not finishing the race in a timely or respectable manner. Without diligence and practice, we may go too quickly, burning out before we're able to get what we want and becoming disabled or quitting before we make it to the finish line. Our challenge and our opportunity is to mindfully train so we find our own optimum pace. That pace is the place where we are able to notice and navigate what is currently in front of us and at the same time be open to learning and exploring what comes next. My hope is that the exercises and ideas in the Mindful Athlete help you move forward with ease and curiosity. It is that sweet spot of relaxed readiness that I found leads to peak learning and performance. Noticing, finding, and cultivating that sweet spot will help you succeed in whatever field you're playing on in this dynamic, ever-changing world. Foreword, Phil Jackson. Over 20 years ago, I asked George Mumford to come and teach our players the skill of mindfulness. George had been recommended by John Kabat-Zinn as a teacher who would fit in well with our players because he knew mindfulness. And he had played basketball and attended the University of Massachusetts back in the day of Al Skinner and Dr. J, so he knew he understood the game. George came and we hit it off. Our relationship blossomed, and now we are working together again in the NBA, and he has written this wonderful book. I had tried using meditation with my Chicago Bulls teams during the early 90s. We had been successful as a team, and I believed that they had the ability to focus on and accomplish whatever tasks were put in front of them. The next group of players that we brought in with the team didn't have Michael Jordan as a leader, and we needed some way to practice focus and concentration, as well as dealing with stress and developing our ability to work together as a team. I thought the team's training in mindfulness should fall on the shoulders of George Mumford as our meditation teacher rather than on me as their coach. We had played one season without Jordan, and we'd done quite well. However, 10 of the 12 players were holdovers from our three-peat championship teams of the early 90s. They had bonded and were seasoned. Our newest group was trying to find that bond. We experimented with quite a few things that season. Instead of the usual two-a-day practices in training camp, for example, we were using a shortened version of conditioning in the morning, taking a break for lunch, and implementing some mental training, and then going back on the court for a full practice. This made for a 6-hour day. It wasn't easy for the players to adapt to this structure, but George taught mental training exercises that really helped us stay fresh and on track. Things took off later that season when Michael came back to the league and to the Bulls. Successes followed over the next three season championships. During this time, the Bulls had a number of players who were in their early 20s, were parents, and were quite mature. This was a good balance because we also had Dennis Rodman and other players with strong personalities in the mix. One day, the players all came out to practice wearing t-shirts that had a cartoon image of the team sleeping during meditation. The shirt showed a bunch of Z's coming out of their heads with the inscription, "Getting Mumfried." George provided great leadership during that period, and I think he gained insight into the mindset of the professional athlete, the attention span athletes had available, and how mindfulness can bear fruit in that context. Next stop for George Mumford and me was Los Angeles and the Lakers. George, who had always lived in Massachusetts, had to fly cross-country regularly to come to California to work with our guys. This was a team that had done reasonably well during the regular season in the past 2 years, but had been swept out of the playoffs in embarrassing style. George had his work cut out for him. With his clarity, humor, and deep knowledge of mindfulness practice, he was able to reach this crew. We set up our video room with theater-style chairs, and George would come in the room and get them to sit on the edge of their seats, assume a relaxed and upright position so they could practice conscious breathing, and he would have them focus on just being right where they were, fully in the present moment. Fast forward 2 years to 2002, and our third attempt to win a title and repeat what had happened at previous Bulls championships. The Sacramento Kings fiercely challenged us that year. The series dragged us into the 7th game on the Kings' court. The morning of the final game, we had an 11 a.m. buffet for a 3 p.m. game, with video for the players before the buffet. My coaching staff and I had met at 9:30 that morning in the hotel cafe to make sure we had covered all our points before we were to meet with our guys. When we made it to our banquet room, 5 minutes ahead of schedule, every player was already in his spot, ready to sit and breathe together. As the game went into overtime that afternoon, the team stayed steady with the same collected calm they had shown before brunch. A lot of athletes think the trick is to getting better is to just work harder, but there is a great power in non-action and in non-thinking. The hardest thing, after all the work and all the time spent on training and technique, is just being fully present in the moment. Time after time, team after team, I have seen athletes transform, and I have seen championships saved by players who believed in George Mumford's one mind, one breath efforts. Introduction. The Zone. 72 million people were watching Game 6 of the 1998 NBA Championship Finals between the Chicago Bulls and the Utah Jazz. With only 18 seconds left in the game and the Jazz ahead by 1 point, an invisible shift seemed to occur. Michael Jordan stripped the ball from Karl Malone, slipped away from Byron Russell so deftly that Russell careened to the floor, and effortlessly made the winning shot with only 5 seconds to spare, bringing the Bulls to their 6th championship and 2nd three-peat. It would be Michael Jordan's and Phil Jackson's last game with the Chicago Bulls, and it is considered one of the greatest plays in NBA sports history. Fans remember what they were doing at the moment the way some people remember where they were when JFK was shot or Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. If you're too young to remember these milestones, fill in the blanks as you see fit. Life is available only in the present moment. Thich Nhat Hanh. I was sitting a few rows behind the bench watching this groundbreaking play unfold, knowing that Michael was in that very special place called The Zone. When I got that rebound, my thoughts were very positive, Michael recounted later. The crowd gets quiet and the moment starts to become the moment for me. That's what we've been trying to do. That's part of the Zen Buddhism stuff. Once you get into the moment, you know you are there. Things start to move slowly. You start to see the court very well. You start reading what the defense is trying to do. I saw that moment. When I saw that moment and the opportunity to take advantage of it, I never doubted myself. I never doubted the whole game. We were hanging too close. I had been doing that Zen Buddhism stuff with the Bulls for 5 years when Michael Jordan made that famous play, and I had seen countless athletes experience the zone. By that time, I'd also taught mindfulness to people in every walk of life, from the locker room to the boardroom, from Yale to jail. Back in the day when I embarked on the journey that would lead me here, people didn't use the word mindfulness. It was called stress management, of which I had plenty, stress, that is. And it was during a moment of extreme stress, crisis really, that Phil Jackson contacted me in 1993. The Bulls had just come out of that three-peat when the team fell into a crisis. Jordan had announced his retirement in the wake of his father's murder. Media attention on Jordan, intense under normal circumstances, had reached an almost frenzied state. Meanwhile, the team's identity was adrift. It had been so wrapped up in Jordan that they were referred to as the Jordan heirs. Without that superstar, public perception of the Bulls' ability to keep their stride hit an all-time low. Team morale went south for the ride. In the midst of this adversity, with team members in various states of emotional distress, Phil had to rebuild the team and bring harmony to discord. That's when he reached out and brought me to his training camp to teach mindfulness and help heal the team. At the time, I was a full-time staff member at the Center for Mindfulness, formerly called the Stress Reduction and Relaxation Program, in Shrewsbury, Massachusetts, and I was teaching mindfulness to prison inmates in a program I helped develop with John Kabat-Zinn in the early 90s. Over the course of 5 years, we taught mindfulness to over 5,000 inmates in 5 different locations. I had never been incarcerated, but in addition to being familiar with the stress experienced by professional athletes, I could understand the stress experienced by some of the inmates because, like many of them, I grew up in the inner city where impulse control is, shall we say, something of a problem. When Michelangelo was asked how he created his masterpieces, he replied that all he did was to chip away to get to the masterpiece that was already inside. I believe we're all chipping away to get to that masterpiece, even those of us who grew up in the ghetto, on the wrong side of the tracks. We all have a divine spark within us, but we've either crushed it, created an ingenious system for hiding out, or devised ways of being that made us feel separate. I now regard each person I meet as a caterpillar in a chrysalis. In order to become butterflies, we have to break our way into freedom and transformation. Mindfulness is a tool we can use to do this in the most skillful way. Admittedly, I had to hit rock bottom with my ass on fire before I figured out the most successful way out of my own chrysalis. Mindfulness was the skillful means to help me emerge, and I have used mindfulness techniques to help athletes of every shape, size, age, gender, and skill level emerge to be their own selves. Mindfulness comes out of a Buddhist meditation, an ancient practice with many layers of complexity. What I offer in this book is a synthesis of mindfulness principles that fall under the aegis of what I call the 5 spiritual superpowers. These superpowers are my personal spin on the Buddha's Eightfold Path and on his teaching of the 5 spiritual faculties: faith, diligence, mindfulness, concentration, and insight. The Eightfold Path was the Buddha's understanding of the way out of suffering. In his book, Old Path, White Clouds, the Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh tells the story of the way the Buddha regarded the Eightfold Path in all his teachings. According to the story, the Buddha said, "My teaching is not a dogma or a doctrine." He goes on, "I must state clearly that my teaching is a method to experience reality and is not reality itself, just as a finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself." Consider these superpowers to be like spokes in a wheel. They are non-linear and they work together. Take one away and the wheel doesn't turn. Remove the hub or the center and we have no wheel. Purists interested in a more traditional approach will find many books on the subject of mindfulness, several written by my friends and esteemed colleagues. At the end of this book, I've collected a list of these that have been most influential to me. Chapter 1, Ass on Fire, the 5 Spiritual Superpowers. Chapter 1, Pain brought me to mindfulness, not any desire to reach nirvana or pop out of any chrysalis. It was unlearning certain habits and thought patterns hardwired in my brain and walking through my pain rather than avoiding it. That ultimately put me on a joyful journey of self-discovery. I grew up in Dorchester, Boston in the 50s and 60s. Here's how the Urban Dictionary defines the place: a ghetto in Boston where hood rats and thugs kill each other over basketball courts, street corners, and anything else they feel like. Most people know to steer clear of this area and let the ghetto rats cull themselves out of existence. End quote. Here's another definition of my hometown you'll read on that site. When walking down Blue Hill, bring a Kevlar helmet and vest. I did not live far from Blue Hill Avenue. You get the picture. I was number 10 in a family of 13 children. I had 7 older sisters, which means that I had 8 mothers. These 8 mothers took care of me when I got hurt, which was often, since I came into this world accident-prone. I was always hitting my head on oven doors, getting stepped on and knocked around. If lightning was going to strike, it would strike me. I've come to realize that stress itself can create a vulnerability to being injury-prone. No doubt I grew up internalizing the stress of my family. That's how the mind-body connection works. Of course, no one knew that back then. We just tried to get by, barely, living paycheck to paycheck. Sometimes the electricity got turned off because we couldn't pay the bill. Other times we had no heat because we couldn't afford heating oil. There were even times when we couldn't go to school because there wasn't enough money for bread or school lunches. My parents did the best they could, all things considered. My mother was an elevator operator in a hotel. My father was a laborer on the New Haven Railroad by day and a barber by night. They both came from a line of Alabama sharecroppers and worked all year under the crack of a whip for $20. Alcoholism was one way they dealt with their pain, and my father carried on that lineage. He was raged on at the railroad, and he raged on us when he came home. No one was spared, not even the family dog. Basically, you did not mess with my father or engage in acts of self-expression unless you wanted serious trouble. I will never forget the day my sister was getting married and I asked him to give me a haircut. He was so outraged by what he thought was a radical request that he shaved me completely bald. I attended the wedding in a veil of humiliation and anger. I learned early to keep my mouth shut. It had taken me decades to unlearn it. When my dad wasn't railing on me for no good reason, the cops or others were doing so. I recall getting pulled over by the police while riding in the backseat of a friend's car. When I asked, "What's the violation, officer?" the officer responded, "Who the F are you, Perry Mason?" I had to be silent, or else I would have been beaten into submission. This, I believe, is the great Western truth, that each of us is a completely unique creature, and that if we are ever to give any gift to the world, it will have to come out of our own experience and fulfillment of our own potentialities, not someone else's. Joseph Campbell. Being African American, I had 2 choices: speak up and get beaten up and often go to jail, or be quiet, be very quiet. I chose the latter option, which became woven into my emotional blueprint. I did not speak up to my father, to cops, or even to coaches. I learned to shut up and be, and I carried that oppression around like an albatross. Whatever emotional pain I experienced, I unconsciously buried in my body. No wonder pain became my constant companion. Looking back now, maybe my dad thought that by literally trying to knock the spirit out of me, he was protecting me from the perils of free thinking. This was the United States of America, in the midst of the 1960s counterculture, after all. As fate would have it, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. used to preach in a church down the street from our house. His freedom marches and the civil rights movement were part of the social fabric of my youth. There was also the birth of rock and roll, the sexual revolution, feminism, peace protests, Vietnam, and the so-called dawning of the Age of Aquarius that lit the stage for the Human Potential Movement. The Esalen Institute in California, and later the Omega Institute in New York, both still thriving today, were beacons of this movement, bookending the country as spiritual centers dedicated to personal transformation, well-being, and consciousness raising. Never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined that decades later I'd be teaching at the Omega Institute myself. In those days, nobody in Dorchester focused on consciousness raising. That word wasn't even in our vocabulary. We focused on survival. As the 60s unfolded in a whirlwind of experimentation and turmoil, I found my nirvana in basketball, music, and drugs. Open your funky mind. I had always played sports in the streets: dodgeball, stickball, baseball, football, and tag. Like millions of inner-city youth, I had NBA dreams from a young age. Sport was a salvation and a way out of the ghetto. I loved the Celtics, the Red Sox, the Lakers, Jerry West, and Elgin Baylor, among others. They fed my dreams when, at 4 feet 11 inches tall, I went to middle school, dribbling with confidence and working on different shooting styles until I perfected a two-handed push shot. I suddenly shot up to 5 feet 11 inches in high school, and my feet became a vortex of growing pains. My injury proneness was just about to escalate to new heights. I used to play with 10-pound weights on each ankle until one day when I went up high to take a shot during a game and landed awkwardly, spraining both of them. From then on, I played with both of my ankles taped up. My knees were stiff and ached constantly. In the spring of my junior year, something popped in my knee. Undaunted, I kept playing until my muscle atrophied, my leg became too weak to run or jump on, and I tore a patella tendon in my left knee. I was injured so often in my youth that I was in crutches every year throughout high school, and I had such intense back pain that I had to sleep on a bedboard. I kept my MBA dreams going, however, until their death knell came when my coach sent me to an orthopedic specialist, and I got the coach in trouble when the specialist billed the high school for his services. My coach rarely put me in games again for fear I'd get hurt. Instead, he urged me to become an accountant. One day, after not getting to play at all, I quit the team. I returned the next day hoping basketball would provide a path to college and a way out. I ended up going to the University of Massachusetts on an academic scholarship with pain as my mascot, but by then I'd picked up a few vices along the way. No one told me when I was growing up that I could alter my consciousness by going within. Even at church, no one even helped me stay in touch with the spark of divinity once I left the pew. I had no real spiritual foundation, though I longed for spirit. I found it first in John Barleycorn. I was given my first taste of beer at about the same time I learned to walk. I liked that enough to move on to my more sophisticated spirits, like my father's Seagram 7 whiskey that I enjoyed in private. At an early age, I found God in getting high and leaving my body, floating into space and taking off. Anything that would get me away from the experience of physical and emotional pain was welcome. I floated further into space in my teens when a group of kids I'd met at a YMCA turned me on to heroin. We called it skag because it was inferior to white boys' heroin. We'd sniff it off the end of nail files or go on about our business. On heroin, my pain lifted and my spirit soared even higher. I could suddenly speak out and be gregarious without fear. Jimi Hendrix had hit the charts in those days, and I could relate to having purple haze all in my brain. Music, in fact, was another form of bliss that got me high, transporting me far away to some Shangri-La of the mind. I recall listening to groups like the Parliament Funkadelic, whose psychedelic lyrics to "free your mind and your ass will follow" spoke to a generation of spirit-seeking junkies. Open up your funky mind and you can see. Free your mind and your ass will follow. The kingdom of heaven is within. I had yet to find the kingdom of heaven within, but I'd certainly found my little helper. There were a lot of ironies around my drug use back then. One of them was that during a hospital visit for chronic pain, I was given Darvon, a powerful pain-killing narcotic. That one little pill packed with white crystalline powder not only relieved my pain, it got me an even more agreeable high than skag. Under the influence of Darvon, the kingdom of heaven felt very near. I was even more outgoing and freer to speak out. I had taken a formal check-in with the medical establishment to tip the scales, but there I was. I had become a bona fide substance abuser. I had no idea that in taking this path, I was robbing myself of the stress hardiness people develop naturally in life, and my descent into drug use didn't follow the traditional trajectory from smoking cigarettes to smoking pot and progressing onwards. I avoided pot because I'd been told that it stunted your physical growth. I wanted every physical possibility to grow tall, so instead I went straight to heroin and stunted my emotional growth. Call that junkie wisdom. Double life. As my drug use became more routine, particularly after high school, I developed a very well-fortified internal firewall that kept two parts of my life separate. I was Joe College during the day and a member of Cool in the Gang at night. Determined that the two should never meet, I also forged an uncanny ability to maintain a double life. That firewall would eventually become my great wall of pain, and double life would be my undoing. But at the time, I had no idea. Sports remained a huge part of my life throughout college when I had the good fortune of rooming at the University of Massachusetts with Dr. J, aka Julius Erving. Dr. J was indisputably the Michael Jordan of his time and would eventually be inducted into the NBA Hall of Fame, but back then we were just all college kids with NBA dreams. We emerge into the daylight not by denying our pain, but by walking out through it. Joan Borisenko. The first time I met Dr. J, he was playing basketball with dress shoes on. My first reaction to this sight was, who is this wiry homie playing basketball and dunking on people in dress shoes? My second thought was, wow, this dude can play. He had great control of his body, could dribble and pass like a guard, jump and rebound like a center, float in the air like a butterfly, and sting like a bee with quick and precise movements that finished in the basket. Everyone was in awe of his physical prowess and agility. He could maneuver in street shoes, even while injured or under duress. He could dunk 2 balls at once with his large hands and excellent hand-eye coordination. Even when Dr. J injured his ankle and could barely walk without limping, he played and dunked on people with grace and ease. Diddle the time he broke his big toe. He just went out anyhow, despite the pain, and played with focus and intention. This is a supreme example of self-efficacy. More on that later. I didn't realize it at the time, but Dr. J was a natural-born mindful athlete who played the inner game before the term was coined. He was always in flow and living fully in the present moment, responding and adapting to what was happening around him rather than reacting and fighting against it. He seemed to let situations speak to him. He observed and learned. He was always upbeat, supportive, encouraging, kind, and generous. Important wholesome qualities for the mindful athlete to develop in order to flourish, yet he held others accountable without making them wrong. He never complained about going to practice, being in pain, or being depressed when he played badly or lost a game. He seemed happy to be alive. I also don't remember anyone running set plays for Dr. J or featuring his talents in any way. He was all about we, not me. He loved playing basketball and developing the craft and didn't complain about other players not being able to dunk or run or about not having other like-minded people on the team with him. Dr. J was the only person of color on both the JV and varsity teams. I would have liked to stay by his side after college, but eventually we parted ways. After his junior year, Dr. J went pro. I simply went professional. Working for the life. On the advice of a coach, I put my passion for sports on the back burner and studied finance in college. I went through the motions and did what I needed to do in order to do okay at finance, but my heart and mind weren't in it. In my mind, I was still playing basketball. By that time, my heroin use had really taken off. I'd gone from sniffing to skin popping to mainlining, and my firewall was stronger than ever. I ended up working as a financial analyst for a company that made sophisticated communications and guidance systems for space shuttles, cruise missiles, and nuclear-powered submarines. I had security clearance on my badge and track marks on my arm. I always made sure to wear long sleeves. I was married for 2 years, and we were together for 9 years. We met in the summer of 1969, got married in 1975, separated in 1977, and the divorce was final in 1978. The divorce was devastating to me, and it was one more sign that my life was falling apart. But I kept up a front at work, increasing because being married gave me carte blanche to be late. It made me seem normal. There was a lot of shame associated with divorce at that time as well, never mind all the other shame-inducing behaviors. Though I managed finances at work, my personal house of finance was a mess. I spent money recklessly on drugs and eventually ruined my credit. I lost my car. To make sure that no one knew about it, I woke up at the crack of dawn, took public transportation to work, and got there early enough to leave by 4 p.m. so no one would see me back on the bus to my mother's house. I'd get dope sick if I didn't get high a couple times a day. In fact, it was probably because I got high so often that I was able to maintain this crazy double life, pushing around my repressed emotional weight like Sisyphus with his boulder. Even when a needle broke off in my arm while I was getting high, I thought I was invincible. I didn't even believe the doctors in the emergency room who told me that if I didn't change my life, I would die. It wasn't until 1984 when I was walking around with a high fever and a severe staph infection that landed me in the emergency room again that I realized just how close to death I was. But yet again, the doctor gave me painkillers when he released me from the hospital. This time, it was the narcotic Percocet. You'd think doctors would understand that giving narcotics to an addict is like giving candy to a kid, But who was I to protest? I ended up selling the Percocet to buy more drugs. The following month, on April 1st, a friend who I hadn't seen in a long time popped into my life out of the blue. He'd been a long-time substance abuser like me, but had gotten solidly clean and sober through the 12-step AA program. That day, he insisted I go to AA meeting with him. I agreed on a whim, but found the meeting was no April Fool's joke. The only way out is always through. Robert Frost, American poet. By then, I was not only sick and tired of being sick and tired, I was more like the walking dead. A refrain in Janis Joplin's song, Me and Bobby McGee, perfectly described that moment. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. That's where I was. I had nothing left to lose, because I'd already lost everything. In a strange, messed up way, I was free. Free to start over from scratch. Free to let down my guard and ask for help. Free to step out of my comfort zones and take risks in an effort to reinvent myself, because the alternative was to die. The renowned spiritual teacher J. Krishnamurti said that freedom is now or never. I choose now.